Hello and welcome to Radio Public Library. Today we have a very special visit from a local author, Bill Franz, who will be talking about his recent book that he published. And the title of the book is Mutti and Papa, a love story. Welcome, Bill. And we will start with Bill's presenting about the book first, and then we'll open for the questions later in the presentation. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that we live and work on Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory of the Indigenous peoples and also the Métis Nation. And just in the last few days, we've been commemorating, remembering Remembrance Day, of course, yesterday, earlier in the week, Indigenous Veterans Day, and also the National Holocaust Education Week. So these are all subjects that are very difficult to process, but nonetheless, it's important that we acknowledge it. I was going to show a few slides from the trip to Ukraine that I took several years ago with my sisters and a couple of their husbands. We went there to look at the lands and the homes of our ancestors, in particular our parents and our grandparents. And so we spent a week in Lviv, which is where my mother's family was from, and from that area. And then we joined a tour, a Mennonite tour starting in Kiev, which then took us down all the way to Odessa on the Black Sea. And that is very much part of my father's story. And then my sisters went to Germany to visit relatives, and I carried on to Russia. You can see most of the story is in the center here. I don't know, you probably can't see my arrow now, but Lviv, Kiev, and down to Odessa on the Black Sea. And then I carried on with the tour to take the Russian extension, which flew from Odessa to Minsk in Belarus, and then on to St. Petersburg, which is on the Gulf of Finland. And we toured St. Petersburg and then took a high-speed train to Moscow and toured Moscow as well. And from there on, I carried on solo to Novosibirsk, where I've got relatives. And that also figures in my story, because my grandmother and my aunt were deported to Siberia after the Second World War. So it was the trip of a lifetime for me and for my sisters. I'm really glad we went. I'm not sure if I'm going to go back, because I spent 17 hours in the air coming back from Novosibirsk. So that's a lot of flying.
We can see her.
Okay, awesome. I've just been told by IT support that people can see my arrow. So this right here is really the focus of my book. Okay, next slide, please. So I was fortunate that we still have the addresses in Lviv. This was my grandparents' store, and I actually printed this off from Google Maps, Google Earth. And so we went to this store, which was very, very moving for us. And we also walked down the street there to the right to a main street, which had the apartment block that my parents or grandparents lived in, and nearby also was the church where my grandmother remarried. My grandfather, my blood grandfather had passed away, and then my grandmother remarried. So next slide, please. But before we got to see the corner store, our guide, we had hired a private guide for the week, and we used Lviv as our base. took us to the cemetery, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's still working, meaning that people still get buried there. So it was primarily for the middle and the upper class, except in Soviet times there was no distinction. But this is near the entrance to the cemetery. I was really taken in by these Greco-Roman statues, and that's a crypt behind it as well. So people often ask me why I chose an image from the cemetery for my book, which is very close to this one here. And, you know, it's because there's, you know, there's a lot of sorrow, there's a lot of death in my book, but there's also hope and love. And I also don't know, but my grandfather might be buried in the cemetery. I just don't know. So I found this really moving. Next slide, please. Here I am with my sisters and I. So starting on the left, my sister Ingrid, then Margaret, and on the far right is Monica. And we're in the village cemetery where 7 generations of my grandmother's family on my mother's side lived. It's called Dornfeld. It was a German village in Ukraine that was settled in 1785, I think it was. And at the end of 1939, with the partition of Poland, everybody got relocated to the west into Poland, German-occupied Poland. So this cemetery is not maintained, but it is fenced, which is good because that keeps the cows out. So we walked all over. It wasn't a good day to be wearing shorts because there were lots of nettles and cow parsnip that we have in Alberta as well. So we did find some graves of our ancestors, but not very many, partly because of the lack of time and also partly because of all the thorny bushes. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the ancestral home of my grandmother, my mother's side. What we see on the right is actually an addition. I think, I'm not sure when the addition was built. It looked pretty old. The family that lives there now, they were all in the yard, and our guide asked if that was an addition, and they confirmed yes. But village life, I think, continues much as it has in the past. You see the cows are roaming free, and it's quite different from the cities. It was also you know, really nice to walk around here and look at the different buildings. And so on my mother's side, a lot of her ancestors and ancestral history, of course, is from this village. Next slide, please. So after a week in Lviv exploring the area around, we also made a day trip to Poland, as one of my brothers-in-law is of Ukrainian and Polish descent. But then we flew to Kiev, and this is the National War Museum in Kiev. And everything is actually quite huge here. And this is some of obviously the military equipment from the war. And I don't know a lot about it, except that, yeah, there's history here. Next slide, please. It seems that every community, I think in Ukraine and Russia, has what we would probably call here a cenotaph, a memorial to the war. And you know, it seems that things in the Soviet Union were always big. You know, the artwork is big, and the statues are big. So this scene here really commemorates a retreating German soldier looking back, and the advancing Soviet soldiers or Russians. You can see everybody touches this machine gun for good luck. I touched it too. Next slide, please. We then took a train from Kiev down to Dnipro, which used to be Dnipropetrovsk, or also known as Ekaterinoslav, named after Catherine the Great. This is obviously a very old tram, and it's still in service. And that's the neat thing when you travel. You see things that you don't, pretty obviously that this is not Red Deer and this is not Calgary. This is another part of the world, which really does open your eyes. Next slide, please. So the Mennonites had two main areas in Ukraine. One was Khortytsa and the other one was Molochna. And this is in the Khortytsa area, which is near the current city of Zaporizhia, also known as Zaporozhye. So there's a 700-plus-year-old oak here that was important to the Mennonites as a gathering place. But prior to that, this was the home of one of the groups of the Cossacks, which are legendary warriors. And what we see here in the foreground is, I think, is a genuine Scythian sculpture. A woman there in the foreground. The other ones I think might be replicas. I don't know for sure. And just off to the right, this could be a Scythian burial ground, or it could be a replica. But we certainly saw those on our tour. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this land has been occupied for a very long time. It has a long history. Next slide, please. I took this from Google Earth, and this is the village where my father was born. At the time, it was called Andrejburg. It was a Lutheran village, and it would have been founded probably in the early 1800s, and now it's known as Chornozemny. What I like about this as well is that you can see how the pattern of development fits the houses basically along the main road. And I think this is typical both in Mennonite communities, but also in Ukrainian and Russian communities. Everybody has their house on the main road, behind is their garden, and then access to their fields. We stopped here. We don't know where my father was born, but we did have a quick look at this village. Next slide, please. So here we are in our tour bus. I know we like to complain bitterly about potholes and about the state of the roads. Let me tell you, they are much worse in Ukraine, and depending where you are in Russia. I think Novosibirsk has the worst roads I've seen in any major city in the world. Our bus got through here, but we're in a full-size coach, and the driver had to take it very slow. But this is typical Ukrainian landscape, which really, just as Canada was known as the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine was as well for Europe. Next slide, please. Just about through the slides. This is in Odessa, and this was our hotel, which was a very nice hotel. Odessa is on the Black Sea, and it is both a resort community and Ukraine's the major port. And it's interesting because I often joke, if I followed my mother's line, I probably would be living in Lviv, which is a city that was founded in the 1200s. Or if I followed my father's line, I'd probably be living in Odessa, because my father wanted to be in the Merchant Marine, and he probably, would have wound up here if the Second World War hadn't happened. The other joke I make is that I'd probably wind up in Siberia, because that was a possibility as well. So anyways, next slide, please. So this is a memorial to the fallen Russian-Ukrainian soldier, Soviet soldier. You see the eternal flame in the foreground. I think it's made of marble or a like stone. And though you can't see it, there's some carvings at the very top of the slide there of people, of combatants, I expect. Next slide, please. And there's a close-up showing a typical Soviet hat, I think, and the weapons. So, and somebody's placed the rose there. So I think that one thing about traveling and learning what's happened in other parts of the world, we tend to see things from our own little corner, you know, and from our Western perspective, but there's other perspectives as well. And I think it's really important to remember that some of the worst fighting actually happened in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. So there's the cover of my book, Mutti and Papa, a love story. Mutti and Papa means mom and dad in German. Next slide, please. Thank you for watching that. That's the email I created just to help me sell some books, and I think it's finally starting to work. billfranz.author@gmail.com. But now I'd like to get into the book reading, if I may.
Yes, please. And I will check if we have any questions on our Facebook page in the meantime.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tatiana. So my book is about my parents and their love story. But it's also a family history, but it doesn't have everything in there because, you know, you can't put in all that genealogy. Most people are not going to want to read all that. And so I start off with the ancestors, of my father, my ancestors of my mother, and then I get into childhood and 30s. But first of all, I'd like to read a bit from the introduction. So I was born in Canada in the mid-1950s to immigrant parents that had met as young people in a refugee camp in West Germany. Mutti and Papa, mom and dad, had been born in what is now Ukraine, but in different countries at the time. Borders kept shifting as a result of war, but in different countries at the time. My first language was German, as a result, and in many respects, my childhood was similar to other children born to immigrant parents in our community. We lived in a working class neighborhood, Winnipeg's West End, also known as Winnipeg Center. My grandparents, an aunt and uncle, lived on the next street over, just a couple of blocks away. We attended First Mennonite Church in our neighborhood, where there were many families just like ours with 3 or 4 kids. I grew up knowing that I had family in Russia. My paternal grandmother, Oma in Rusland, who lived in Siberia with her daughter and son-in-law and their children. I knew my paternal grandfather had disappeared during the war. My father had been wounded several weeks before the war ended while serving in the German army, the Wehrmacht, and that he could not go back to see his mother and sister. What to make of Papa's war service in the Wehrmacht of Nazi Germany? As his son, I've been reflecting on this for more than 50 years. In grade 5, I was selected to recite John McCrae's war poem in Flanders Fields at the elementary school's Remembrance Day service. John McCrae was a Canadian soldier, physician, and poet in the First World War. He wrote this poem in 1915, the day after one of his closest friends was killed in the fighting, and buried in a makeshift grave with a simple wooden cross. Every school child in Canada learns this poem, which begins with, "In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row." The red poppies that McCrae refers to are still worn in Canada and other countries of the British Commonwealth in the days leading up to Remembrance Day. My father had the day off from work that Remembrance Day, and I remember him raking leaves in the yard. I asked him, "Papa, what do you think of on Remembrance Day?" He answered, "I think of all the people who died." As a young teenager in grade 8 or so, I challenged my father with the words, "Did you ever kill anyone?" His face turned red. He answered no, and he walked away. A couple of years later, I asked Mr. Karl Fast, the German teacher I respected, "Mr. Fast, what is war like?" His face turned red. He said, "War is hell," and turned away. I've never forgotten Mr. Fast's reaction. It informs my thoughts on war to this day. I was raised in the Mennonite tradition, which historically includes pacifism as church doctrine. The peace position of the church interprets, you shall not kill. One of the 10 commandments is literal and applies to armed conflict between nations. Hence, Mennonites have traditionally refused military service and sought instead to perform alternate service as conscientious objectors. Yet my father volunteered to join the Wehrmacht, and it was important to him that we understood that. I can understand that for a 16-year-old boy whose father and uncles had been taken away into forced labor by the Soviets, a fate my father narrowly avoided, the Wehrmacht would have been seen as liberators. News of the outside world was tightly controlled in Stalin's regime, and it is likely that most inhabitants of the Mennonite towns and villages in the Molochna colony would not have heard much of anything about the oppression of the Jewish people by the Nazis. My father said that he was glad that he had volunteered for the Wehrmacht in 1941, as the boys who had not were drafted in 1943, and they were drafted into the SS. He said it would have been worse. A classmate of his who sat on the same bench was drafted into the SS and was sent in to quell the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and perished in that action. My father did say it was terrible what happened to the Jews. Probably the best answer I can give in reflection on his war services is reflection. Those were not normal times. Maybe I'll just skip ahead a little bit here. German guilt is something that I've wrestled with for many years. Not the guilt, perhaps, of those who served on the other side of the conflict, but rather the guilt that you feel because your father and perhaps your grandfather served in the Wehrmacht or other forces of Nazi Germany. I asked a cousin of mine who grew up in the Soviet Union after the war what she thought. And she said, those who have committed evil are dead and will have to answer for it. I understand this to mean that there may not be justice in this world, but there will be judgment in the next. 75 years have passed since the end of World War II, and yet the subject continues to loom large in both national and social discourse. World War II was the deadliest military conflict in history. Estimates of total dead for both military and civilian deaths vary widely from 35 million to 60 million. And there's been renewed interest in Mennonite circles in historical analysis and revisiting accounts of those not normal times. So my father's family, they were Dutch, Low German Mennonites who left that area possibly in 1540 or later to escape religious persecution. And they went to West Prussia, which is now Poland. My mother's family, they were Lutheran from Southwest Germany, and they left that area in 1804 because of the Napoleonic Wars. Many Germans, Lutherans, Mennonites, Catholics moved to the Black Sea area to escape the constant fighting. I'll just move to the chapter Childhood in the 30s. I'll quote from the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia Online. In the two largest European dictatorships, Germany and the Soviet Union, the war against the individual citizen started in the early 1930s. And in the Soviet Union, that war was as costly in human lives as the later international conflict of World War II. The impact of the Stalin terror on Soviet society was devastating. So this is all introduction to the main part of the book, which is my parents' love letters. So the next chapter is the bombs were falling in Lemberg, which is Lviv, the partition of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, Poland was invaded by Nazi Germany. The German-Soviet non-aggression pact had been signed in Moscow on August 23rd. The Soviet Union invaded Poland on September 17th. The campaigns concluded in early October with Poland divided and annexed. What happened after that? Everybody of German descent got moved west, and Polish people and other Slavic peoples got moved east, and it was very bad for the Jewish people. Okay, so I think I have time to maybe just take a look at my father's life story. He wrote a couple of pages. They're quite brief, but it really was a pivotal moment in his life. In 1941, after Johann had come home and entered grade 8, after tuition at the Naval Training Center in Kherson he attended was no longer free, and his parents could no longer support him, the German-Russian War began. He applied for an apprenticeship as a locksmith in Zaporozhye near Kortitsa. One day, the whole school was assigned to dig trenches to stop the German Panzer tanks and was sent to a field outside the city. Unfortunately, the organizers forgot to provide the students with food and water, and there were no spades available. As he learned that the school was about to be evacuated to Krasnodar, he contacted his father to ask what to do, whether to go with the school or to come home. His father said to come home because they would be relocated anyways. At least this way they'd be together as a family. The next day, he came home without the necessary travel papers and did not register his whereabouts with the authorities as required. Every now and then, people went from house to house looking for men and boys to go digging trenches. Johann would keep watch and disappear through the garden when they did. In his last days in his hometown, he left the house only after dark. On the 5th of September, Johann's father came home by bicycle to say goodbye. That was the last time they saw each other. The front came closer and closer. At the end of September, an NKVD officer, the Soviet secret police, came into the house and read the family the petition. He let them know about their evacuation to Kazakhstan and registered Johann's mother and sister Gretel for deportation. In the afternoon, the officer came back to the house. Johann's mother said he had just come home and asked if he could go with them. When asked how old he was, his mother said 15, a year younger than he really was. If she had truthfully said he was 16, Johann would likely have been deported into forced labor or conscripted into the Soviet army. So I think I'll just move ahead here a little bit. There's a chapter on forced labor. A letter from my grandfather that the family received many years later. I have a chapter on the German army, the Wehrmacht, in particular the 1st Mountain Division, which was the unit that my father had volunteered with. He volunteered as an interpreter, as a translator. And then a couple of months later, on New Year's Day, he was officially conscripted. And with that 1st Mountain Division, they went east, and then they tried to get over the Caucasus Mountains to get at the oil fields, but were driven back. And then after the battle at Stalingrad, which really was the turning point of the war, the German retreat began. And my father was transported by train over the Straits of Kerch and through Romania and Bulgaria to Greece. And several weeks before the war ended, he caught some shrapnel in his leg, and he was evacuated by troop train to Austria. and he recuperated in a hospital, a military hospital in Linz for a couple of years. And from there, he walked out of that hospital pretending to have papers, and he made his way to West Germany, to the refugee camp at Bucknang, because he had heard there were people there from his area. And that's where he met my mom. Her story is also fascinating. They spent 5 years in 4.5, 5 years in what is known as Luch, and that's a city in Western Poland. From there, they fled in January of 45 to the west. They didn't quite make it all the way to the west, but so they were in Leipzig, which was in the Russian zone, which then became East Germany. So the family escaped from that as well, and went to Bucknang, and that's where my parents met. And my father asked my mother to marry him, I would say a week or 10 days before she actually sailed for Canada. So, you know, she had been given permission to emigrate. She finally got her visa, and she went. She was supposed to go with a couple of girlfriends. I don't know what happened, but she went on her own. She was 19 years old. And the day she sailed is actually the day that my father found out that he had actually been rejected. So much of their letters have to deal with that and what to do. And, you know, it's that's actually very, very moving. So the first 50 pages or so are kind of the grand introduction to my parents' love letters, which are over 100 pages. I would say probably only about 10% is the book. I chose the most important parts to tell the story. And there's a happy ending because, yes, my father was granted permission to come, so they were reunited. Just checking the time here. Maybe I'll just read a little bit, if I could, from the beginning of my mother's letters. So she writes from the train. I guess she postmarked it at Heidelberg, and she writes to my father, Johann Franz in Bucknang. She writes, "I am really special. I'm not from Poland. I'm from Switzerland." And so my mother obviously enjoyed that the train was named the Alpine Express. "Incredible," she says. "Greetings, everyone. And don't worry, we will and want to see each other again." And a little later, a couple of days later, she writes from Bremen in Germany. She says, dear Hans, or Hänschen, derivative, "If you get notification from London, write me right away by airmail, yes? No matter whether it turns out negative or affirmative. If negative, then we will have to try things differently. We have to have hope, otherwise. I would turn around and go to Uruguay with you, or stay here just to be with you." I'm sorry, it's always a little bit of emotional, and I never know when the emotions are gonna hit. She says, "Hänschen, I have such a longing for you, my dear sorcerer, so far from me now. Only my memory of the beautiful hours is left." Then she writes again, Dear Hans, I would have liked to have sent you an express letter, but it is now forbidden to leave the camp." And then she writes, my father writes back. He says, from Bucknang, he says, "My dear Ella, received your express letter from January the 7th today, and will answer right away. Perhaps it will reach you in time. Your mom brought your letter to me at work, and I was very happy. I opened it right away and read it." He said, I received a letter, next part's too emotional. "I received a letter from my aunt in Canada the day before. They promised to do all that is necessary to get me across, so please don't worry. We will be reunited again. The main thing is that we want to be. If it doesn't work out right away with London, of which I am skeptical, then I will write to all my relatives, and then it must work out." Dear Ella, you're a nice girl. I don't think I deserve you sometimes. Hopefully it won't take me too long to get over there. What will it be like when I hug you again after such a long, long time? Don't make it too difficult for yourself. Everything will be fine. So there's a picture of a ship that my mother sailed on. And my father writes to Mennonite Central Committee to ask what should he do, because he's just been turned down by London. And MCC's Peter Dick writes back, and he tries to be positive, but he basically says that, you know, there's not a lot of hope for you in your situation. The fact that you served as a soldier for 3.5 years, and the fact that you're somewhat lamed from your war injuries, he's not very optimistic. So you can imagine the emotions that my parents went through. And but in October of that year, my father sailed with my mother's mother and her stepfather and her half sister and half brother. My mother was working near Ottawa and then in Ottawa as a domestic servant, learning English. My father came as part of the 1,000 farm families scheme, and he went to a farm just west of Winnipeg. When my mother completed her 1 year of domestic service, she also came to Winnipeg, and that's where they were able to get married and start their married life. I got a few maps, historical maps, and also maps of members of the family during the Second World War and after. And the end is quite short. I write a little bit about my parents' life, a couple of pages. My mom passed away in 2003, my dad in 2004. A couple of years before my mom got ill, we were talking about going back to Ukraine to see where they came from, and then, but once she got sick, we didn't talk about it anymore. So when my sisters and I went in 2018, it was very, very, very moving. So yeah, I think that's probably enough for now. Thank you.
Yeah, it was kind of riveting to listen to you read all those different parts of the book, and a huge trip that you made, a trip of your lifetime that you said before you wrote the book. So why did you write the book? Why? What was the catalyst? Yeah.
Well, I like to say that I want to be a writer before I grow up, and now I'm a senior citizen. I'm out of excuses. So they say that you should write about something that you know about, but also something that you want to learn more about. I primarily wrote this book for the family, for our kids and grandkids, so they would know what what their grandparents went through to come to Canada. But and I'm also hoping it's of interest both to the Mennonite community, but also to the general community, the community at large. My father would be, I think, blown away to know that there are now more displaced people, more refugees than there were at the end of the Second World War. And so, although this is a very personal story, my parents' story, it's also many other people have similar stories, and these same stories are actually being played out today with migrants and refugees and conflicts that are happening. So that's why I wrote the book.
You read that part from the book that you start off the book with reciting from the Flanders Fields as a 10-year-old in grade 5 at the Remembrance Day service. And so how do you respond to Remembrance Day now yourself? and like we did celebrate it yesterday. So, and it is a Remembrance Day for all the wars and everybody who died in all the wars. So, what are your feelings about that day?
Oh, they're very, very mixed, and it's always a difficult week, and I know it is for many people. Both people here in Canada, United States, but also I think, and maybe particularly so in Europe and in Russia. I mean, millions and millions of people have died, and so people have lost family members. I just recently read a piece on BBC about how Germany remembers the wars. So there's lots of nuances to it, and I think we have to remember that those are human beings on the other side of the conflict with the same hopes and dreams and fears, that we have. So I think perhaps my perspective is somewhat unique because my father served in the German army, but my family actually, and my wife's family had family members that served on both sides of the conflict, both World War II and World War I, and I think that's probably the case for a lot of people.
So what are the themes you explore in the book, in your book? The overarching theme is, of course, the love story of your parents, which is kind of really amazing, but there is more to that, right? So what is it about?
Well, part of it is this issue of German guilt, which I've been asked about. Like, I didn't make up that term. I read it written by another writer, actually in Calgary, writing about his grandfather, basically. So that is a theme. But I think probably more than anything else, I think I keep saying it on Facebook, war is hell. And it really is. And I think our perspective here in Canada, we haven't had a war on Canadian soil since 1812, since the Americans invaded and we beat them back. I think if you've had war on your soil, for example, in Europe or in the Far East, it's a much different perspective that you might have, and so yeah, I think I answered your question.
Okay. So how do you think that people might respond to your book when they realize what it's about? Because it says Mutti and Papa love story, but it is about German guilt, and it is about you coming to terms with the fact that your father served in German army, and what kind of reactions have you had so far?
It's been really interesting. There was a time when I thought, no, I can't read this book, because I said to write this book because I said to friends, yeah, I was showing them some photographs, and yes, here's my father's photo from the Second World War, and their face, changed for just a second there, right? And it's like, oh, I don't know if I can do this, and I think it's important to realize that we've all been affected by it, and I have friends that are Jewish. My brother-in-law is Ukrainian and Polish. I have friends that are Russian. I have family that lives in Russia. It's a really sensitive topic, and not easy to write about it. And I don't want to trigger anybody. I think we probably should recognize that we're probably all suffering from intergenerational trauma in one way or another. I remember a friend telling me that after I came back from Russia, somebody asked, how was Russia, Bill? And I blurted something out without even thinking, and I realized, oh, that didn't sound very good. And my friend said, Bill, you're suffering from intergenerational trauma. And I thought, no, that's not possible. I mean, I can understand how Jewish people would be, or indigenous people, or, you know, but no, I can't, I don't see that. But I've come to realize, yeah, you know, that is true. I think we all do. We all carry it somehow. And so I have to say, in a lot of ways, that this has been somewhat freeing for me to talk about it, and to yeah, I think it's important to talk about these things. I really do.
Would you encourage others, would-be writers, to write about difficult subjects?
I would. It depends, I guess, on what you like to read. You know, one of my favorite authors, and I haven't read him for quite a while, I don't have all his books, but I have a few of his books, is Michael Hamdachi, you know, who is from what was known as Ceylon and is now Sri Lanka. So he writes novels, and you know, a novel is one format where you can write about the truth, but you can maybe express it, you know, that you know the truth is there, but you can't maybe pin it down on one particular person or another. You know, my own book is, I guess, I didn't know there's a genre for it, but the genre is creative nonfiction. So you know, it's a biography, autobiography as well. It's creative nonfiction. It is factual. There's a couple of errors in it that you know, they're minor, but they always show up after it goes to print, right? I would. But as I said earlier, I think you need to write about something that you know. Otherwise, people will see through. If I write a book about living in Tahiti, for example, I mean, I've been to Hawaii, but I've never been to Tahiti. So if you're from Tahiti, you'll probably know that I don't know what I'm talking about. But the other thing is that, you know, if you want it to be interesting for the reader, it has to be interesting for the writer. And so, especially if you're looking at a family history book, there's many things that you know. There's things that you obviously don't know. And so you can find things out. You can find things out, you know, through other books on the internet. We've got the World Wide Web at our fingertips. You know, I had some family documents, I had some family photos, and I had the stories that I remembered and the stories that my sisters heard. So that's how this book came together. But yeah, I would encourage it. It's not easy, but I think anything worth doing is not easy.
Right. Yeah. So, and the last question. So that was your first book. Is it the last, or there are plans to write more? What are your plans?
Yes, I hope to work on a sequel this winter. I had the letters that my grandmother wrote to my father from Novosibirsk, Siberia. And they found each other in 1956. So the last time they saw each other was 1943.
Wow.
So in the 1950s, people were writing letters. The International Red Cross, I understand, is actually what connected them. And so thereafter, they wrote to each other monthly until she passed away in 1975. So I have her letters. I don't have his letters. I'm going to read them because I'm interested in what she had to say and what they had to say to each other. And it's interesting because I never met my grandmother. I never talked to her on the phone. And when I met my first cousin, Anna, she said, we didn't have a phone, you know, so, but she wrote me lovely postcards and letters for my birthday. So I feel I did get to know her. And then also seeing where they lived, you know, meant an awful lot. So yeah, that's my next project.
That's exciting. So, and I'm very happy to let everybody know who is interested in reading Bill's book is that we have a copy at the library, which Bill generously donated. It has been added to the collection, and there is currently one hold on it. It's on hold for somebody, but you are very welcome to read it. And I believe that, yeah, Bill, where else people can purchase your book?
Well, I also have books on consignment at Eastview Apple Drugs. There's only one left, so I'm going to go see if they want more. That's been a really great venue for me. Part of my shtick in Red Deer is that I'll deliver by bicycle. I mean, winter's coming, so I might not. But I also sell them directly for $20, and I'm happy to, you know, to drop them off or meet somebody at, you know, Bauer Mall or Cafe Vero or wherever. I've done a lot of book selling at Cafe Vero, meeting friends. So yeah, I sell them for $20. And yeah, so if you want to contact me, I created an email just for this. It's billfranz.author@gmail.com.
Yeah, and it has been mentioned in a presentation earlier, so you may be able to go down a little bit in the video, because this presentation will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. And write down this email and contact Bill if you are interested in reading this fascinating story. And well, Bill, thank you very much for sharing the story of writing your book with Reader Public Library and Reader Public Library members. And we will be waiting for the sequel. It is not an easy way that your parents ended up in Canada, and it definitely very, very interesting story. So I hope people will enjoy reading your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. And thank you, everybody.